To quote that sassy American hip-hop group, Salt and Pepper, from their early 90s hit, let's talk about sex. We're doing that today because Paul was doing that as he wrote to the Corinthians. In an age that is supposedly open about sex and sexuality, many people are still highly embarrassed to talk honestly with others about sex. Whether that's young people who are dating, or older people who are married, or parents trying to raise children, we might wonder why this topic makes us so uncomfortable. It's a strange paradox that in our society, sex is pushed about publicly, being advertised and exploited without qualm, whilst privately we don't mention it with people we know and trust, especially if we have problems cause significant distress, which most of us will have from time to time. We all know the Church's poor history of dealing with sex and sexuality, so I'll need not explore that now. But we need to be honest. This is not just a problem from the past we look back on with regret. Our poor approach remains a problem, doing damage to many within the life of the Church, and about which supposedly mature Christians struggle to even talk about in helpful ways. We Christians need to be clear and explicit in our conversations and teaching. Instead of being hidden away, it must be regularly brought out front and centre in our preaching and study groups. Paul certainly did not have these hang-ups in his pastoral ministry. He wrote frequently about sex and sexuality precisely because they are key aspects of being human and of being disciples of Jesus. Last week, Steve took us through the end of chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians, where Paul challenges the silence and lack of response by the church to those using prostitutes for sex. He gets them to question how they use their freedom by asking them to reflect on their behaviours in light of what is beneficial to them and those which allow them to be in control of their bodies, using them for God and good rather than being dominated by their hungers and desires. Paul not only confronts their immorality and calls for more appropriate Christian behaviour, but also presents a positive view of sex as part of God's good creation and a way whereby we can glorify God with our body. Now, as we move into chapter 7, Paul tells us that, unlike the previous 6 chapters where he was responding to reports he had heard about the church, he is now answering questions which they had raised with him directly in a letter. And their first set of questions focus on the appropriateness of sex, particularly within marriage. Today I'm going to look at what he says in the first 6 verses of this chapter. Next week we'll look at questions of singleness and sex, which come straight after, and which are relevant to all of us, married and single. It's essential that we understand what's happening here so that we will not distort Paul's teaching. Paul is dealing flexibly with pastoral issues. He's not writing a full theology of sex or Christian marriage or singleness or divorce. Paul's view of sex and marriage have been widely misunderstood over the centuries. One of the reasons for this is that until relatively modern times, it was not widely recognised that in verse 1 he is quoting a maxim used by the Corinthians rather than making a statement of his own understanding. The Greek in Paul's day did not use quotation marks, and readers had to judge what passage embodied quotations. Paul will do this a number of times from this point onwards in the rest of the letter. If you want to see how it functions, go to any good modern commentary. When he responds to the matters about which they wrote, he tells them and says, "It is a good thing for a man not to touch a woman." This was one of the views that they had and were teaching at Corinth. Therefore, you need to check the version of the Bible you are using, because this verse is translated in various misleading ways, such as "it is good not to marry," or even "it's good not to have sexual relationships." Let's go from the clear to the less clear so we can try and understand what is happening and what Paul is teaching. Now, I think it's true to conclude from previous issues raised in the letter that we can see that some at Corinth argued spirituality had nothing to do with bodily actions, but was an inner, private state of mind or knowledge possessed by those who are wise. Because the body was of no consequence, this led to either some taking a total license to do whatever they wanted, or by contrast, others pursuing ascetic self-denial. Paul utterly rejects both options as unchristian. For it's the body which is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and it is the body which is for the Lord, he writes. Many Christians today fall into this similar trap by thinking that the spiritual life is only about Bible reading and prayer and ecstatic experiences in church. We must take seriously physical, emotional, social, relational and environmental factors, which also are composites of human life and therefore part of our spiritual response to God. Let's return particularly though to this topic of sex and try and dig a little deeper into the specifics of what was going on, because it's something other than that type of dualism which sharply divided body and soul and which would later develop into full-blown Christian Gnosticism in the following century. Because we need to fit together the apparent asceticism of this passage and the previous one, which showed they had no concern at all over sexual activity being conducted with prostitutes. Now, it might be that there were two different groups within the church community who took opposite approaches. It might have been that there was a more nuanced position with those who regarded themselves as the strong, valuing sexual abstinence for themselves, while at the same time showing little anxiety about the sexual misdemeanours of weaker people at Corinth. Their own sexual control is worn as a badge of higher status and spirituality than those lower down the ladder, and was a way of entrenching their self-perceived superiority. There was certainly a very similar approach to this when it comes to diet and food, which we'll get to later. That similar idea about the body. But the Corinthians were obviously not anti-sex. That's the problem in the previous chapter, isn't it? So I don't think this approach explains things well enough. Let's be clear. The issue is not sex itself. Instead, they are limiting sex in marriage. If we look at the chapter as an integrated whole, we see at least some in Corinth were advocating some form of sexual abstinence within marriage, either as a constraint upon those already married, or as a reason to avoid marriage totally, or as a reason to try and get out of marriages, so that they could avoid marital sex. They were obviously motivated by their understanding of what would make a good Christian life. We need to understand why they wanted to do this, and perhaps also recognise it was a particular form of sexual expression that they were against or worried about. As we've seen previously, they were carrying over the attitudes and understandings of life inherited from their culture and then morphing them into their Christian expression. So first, we must understand how sex and marriage were thought about in the ancient Roman world, which Corinthian culture expressed on steroids. There was a running debate in the Roman world over whether sex was to be engaged in only for procreation and thereby establishing legal heirs, or if it was also for recreation for the purposes of pleasure. However, even those who thought recreational sex for pleasure was okay usually sought it outside of marriage, particularly with prostitutes and household slaves. Why? Because marriages weren't entered into out of affection or seeking pleasure. The Latin poet Ovid expressed a common view, writing, "There could be no erotic pleasure, amor, between husband and wife because it was a relationship of duty." Roman philosophy and social structure all focused on the man, especially the paterfamilias. Indeed, the great Roman virtue, Romanitas or Romanness, was all about being a great, courageous, manly guy with gravitas, the citizen soldier farmer who ruled over others as a generous benefactor and patriarch. This drove the Roman ideal of the elite male, being those who were in control of their passions and so didn't express them in the social relationship of marriage. A woman was expected not to have any passions and so was always to remain self-controlled, whilst a man could express them but only to those who were subordinates to him in social status, like slaves or prostitutes or younger lower-class boys. As an aside, when you read about adultery in the New Testament epistles, remember that they use this word in a far more limited way than we do, referring only to a man having sex with another man's wife and thereby defrauding him of what belonged to him. A man who had extramarital sex with slaves or with prostitutes, whether they were male or female, did not commit adultery. It was commonly accepted practice as long as it was done discreetly. But the critical thing to remember here is that the Corinthians were seeking to be good Christian citizens, expressing a wise spirituality which would make them strong and part of the elite, all framed by the values of their day. Recent scholarship indicates it's likely the Corinthians were divided between those who thought sex should be reserved within marriage for procreation only and those who felt recreational sex was a physical need to be met outside the marriage with prostitutes and slaves. Neither group advocated sex for pleasure within marriage. This understanding will give critical help in understanding what Paul teaches about singleness and divorce in the following verses. And this secondarily lets us think particularly of the type of sexual expression they were worried about. The euphemism touch in verse 1 is best understood here as referring to sexual activity not related to procreation but only for pleasure. New Testament scholars Roy Camper and Brian Rosner marshalled the evidence convincingly to show that it was used for types of sexual relations that would not have been condoned by ancient Roman moralists. The Roman idea and ideal of proper masculinity and expressing sexual activity was men taking the active dominant role. The desire or willingness to play the passive sexual role was considered shameful. It was expected that men of stature would be literally and metaphorically hard men, penetrating people of lesser status, whether they were women or men, but they themselves would not be penetrated, nor would they serve passively for the pleasure of others. For example, in giving oral sex, whether fellatio or cunnilingus, or being the passive partner in anal sex. All such giving to serve the pleasure of another was degrading servitude. It was about men using others for their own pleasure rather than being weak enough to allow others to take pleasure through their relationships with them. It was all about taking. So engaging in sex for pleasure in marriage was both exposing to your wife your own weakness by showing her your neediness, and even worse, letting her needs and desires govern your own whenever you did anything which gave her pleasure rather than using her for yourself. Paul rejects all of these behaviours and attitudes by working against the selfish exploitation of power by men and elevating the status and power of women in a marriage of sexual relationship. As we're about to see in what he writes in reply, Paul is changing the understanding of gender. Just as Paul turned upside down the Roman ideals of manliness through power and status, speech and wisdom and success, so he inverts the economy of what true manliness and humanity looks like for followers of the way in marriage and sex. It's profoundly countercultural. Paul revises the property ethic, which taught that wives and slaves belonged to the paterfamilias to use for himself as the all-powerful head of the household. He was free to get whatever he wanted without regard for its impact upon others. Rather, Paul says in verse 2, marriage is the appropriate place to express and act upon sexual desire, rather than outsourcing these in what he regards as immoral relationships. He says this because the sexual impulse is strong and in fact part of God's good creation, and it needs an appropriate place to be expressed if someone has such desires within themselves. He recognises that some can live happily a life of singleness and celibacy, like himself, but for others this is not their circumstance and nor their disposition. Passion and romance and sexual pleasure do have a place within marriage because sex is for more than just procreation, says Paul. It's interesting that Paul and Jesus never gives as a purpose for marriage the procreation of legitimate heirs, which was the dominant political, philosophical and medical focus of the ancient world. Rather, it's about the bodily needs of both women and men as part of a loving relationship in which the two become one, as he said in verse 16 of chapter 6. Marriage is entered into not for the sake of bearing children, but for the sake of expressing desire in helpful ways. So this answers some who've been dismissive of Paul's teaching on sex and marriage here because of their misinterpretation of what he writes. Paul is not viewing the reason for marriage primarily as a defence against demeaning and uncontainable sexual desire leading to immorality, some sort of prophylactic. You know, that sort of idea. The Christian teaching is presented as, well, you better marry because you can't restrain yourselves from doing all these naughty things. Rather, Paul is actually advocating healthy sexual pleasure as a good and wonderful thing to be expressed freely. And he's defending against a demeaning marriage where that isn't present or is used manipulatively. Paul wants healthy sexual expression within marriages, leading to a contentment and joy in both wife and husband within their exclusive relationship. Which is another revolutionary thing he says in verse 3. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Paul is reframing sex. For the Corinthians, imposing men did the touching. They were not touched back. Paul says strength is shown in weakness and vulnerability, as well as agency, and so both touching and being touched are to be shared by the husband and wife within the safety and sanctity of marriage. The phrase fulfill duty is literally give back that which is owed. Jennifer Wright-Knust, in her fascinating and cleverly titled book Unprotected Texts, translates verse 3 more literally and helpfully as, the man should give what he owes to his wife, and in the same way the woman should give this to the man. The word Paul uses here was used of payment of what is due as an obligation. Paul is drawing upon common Jewish tradition. It's also preserved in the 2nd century Jewish writings known as the Mishnah about what obligations husbands and wives had to one another. We'll come back to this whole topic when we explore the question of divorce. But chapters 5 to 7 of 1 Corinthians have a consistent theme of people using power to defraud or take what is not rightly theirs, whether it's through the civil law courts, through sexual immorality in incest, or robbing one another, a spouse, of their sexual pleasure, or taking one's neighbour an honour and dignity, which we'll see later on. In speaking of obligations, the main point that Paul is making is not one of rights, but rather one of duties. Roman law gave the husband absolute rights over his wife, but Paul teaches here a mutual duty to one another. It's not selfishly demanding what you want, but rather selflessly being responsive to give what the other needs, and in no sense withholding that for selfish reasons. And look at who determines this. Hear carefully verse 4. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. For the husband to have authority over his wife's body was nothing special in the ancient world, but for the wife to have that over her husband was amazing. The only other ancient text which seems to come close to this sort of mutuality is the Song of Solomon, the Song of Songs. Remember, Paul is giving this authority to a wife who was almost always considerably younger and certainly much lower in social status than her husband, and so regarded as intrinsically inferior. She is allowed to dictate the parameters of his sexual behaviours. Paul says that in Christian marriage we belong to one another as equals, and the authority we have over our own body is given away freely, entrusted to our spouse, not to deprive or defraud one another, but to give opportunities for an expression of our love and trust in mutual regard. Instead of a very hierarchical and unilateral understanding, Paul is remarkably egalitarian. This mutuality permeates all that he's about to teach on marriage, singleness, divorce through the rest of the chapter. This is all the wisdom of the cross. Paul teaches that giving in service and sacrifice is actually the demonstration of power and God's wisdom in the world, and that this should also characterize the marriage, including the sexual aspects of the marriage relationship. We're concerned for the needs and well-being and pleasure of the other before ourselves. True Christ-like love is patient and kind, not arrogant or self-seeking, but looks to the other's good to benefit them, as he'll describe in chapter 13. This is true of spirituality and it's true of sexuality, teaching us to use our body to serve rather than to seek its own pleasure. It brings about true delight and desire, flowering in freedom and beauty, husband and wife belonging to one another in equality, opportunity and agency. Sex becomes a means of communication through an act of giving and receiving, that which enriches both people and draws them closer together. Good sex requires both husband and wife to think how best to give to each other pleasure through their lovemaking, creativity, responsiveness, arousal, satisfaction to each other. It's not a way of self-gratification, but a very practical way of submitting to each other and one another's needs and desires. Therefore, it's an incredibly spiritual action because it requires the heart of a disciple who submits to others out of reverence for Christ. Of course, the levels of desire go up and down because of all sorts of circumstances like stress or raging or tiredness, so we need to be responsive and responsible as we think about the other person. But please don't let this text be abused. It is never about demanding your rights. It is never about forcing the other to perform because you want it. This is the very opposite of love, of Christ-likeness, and of what Paul is describing. Paul will never tolerate rape in marriage or sexual abuse with a man conquering and colonising while the woman surrenders and accepts. Maybe 50 Shades of Grey might be entertained as an occasional fantasy, but for Paul it should never be the actuality of how women and men relate to one another in a sexually healthy way. Paul is radically against the view that runs all the way back to Aristotle, that sex is an exercise of authority and power by men over females who submit. Rather, it's about each making themselves vulnerable and letting the other see their needs and desires and how they hand over their entire happiness of this being satisfied to the free giving of the other. Paul says the Christian who asks, "Who controls my body?" should answer that question, first of all, Christ, and then secondarily, my spouse. Good sex is ultimately not about me, but neither is it ultimately about you, my partner. It's about us. In marriage, I am we, and you are we. We are we, one flesh. Paul is teaching the Corinthians that marriage relationship is to be seen as the union of the two whole persons, rather than just a social contract providing posterity for your name through children and a platform for economic and social advancement through the stability and unity of a household unit. This is why in verses 5 and 6 he says not to harm the marriage by depriving either yourself or the other. Do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. To deprive each other, Paul uses a word which takes up causing another to suffer loss by taking away what is rightly theirs. Do not deprive is don't defraud. Don't cheat someone out of what is theirs. It was used of robbing and stealing and defrauding in business or not paying a labourer their wages. It's the same word used in the Septuagint of Exodus 21:10, which prohibited the deprivation of sexual obligations. We'll come back to this passage when we discuss divorce, but I just want to put a flag there. Paul says that prolonged or permanent sexual abstinence for simply spiritual rather than any physical reason robs the spouse of his or her rights to what is actually theirs. In verse 5, he gets to the dangerous consequence of all this, and this is, I think, what worries him. Paul has identified something wrong in their approach to marriage and sex, and as if they are ceasing from sex within marriage for some spiritual reason, the danger is that they'll be tempted to find other avenues to express their sexual desire, and lacking self-control, engage in sex with someone who is not their spouse. In verse 6, Paul makes it clear that abstinence from sex is a concession he's making and not a command. He's not commanding couples to stop having sex so they can pray, but allowing them to do so if both agree it's helpful for them, in allowing them to concentrate in prayer for a while, but then going back to expressing normal desires. If they have a temporary agreement, that's okay, especially if their focus is to do something important like pray, but not even this is required, and we shouldn't set those two things up as opposites. This concession isn't about allowing marriage, but allowing brief cessation in sex. He never insists on married couples abstaining from sex so they can pray. So if the couple chooses for a short period of time to abstain, they can do so to focus on prayer, but it must only be by mutual agreement. This means sex should never be used as a bribe or reward for behaving in ways that the other wants, nor withheld as a threat or punishment. Paul stands against any such manipulative and abusive behaviour. Using sex in power plays is anti-Christian and unthinkable for Paul. Likewise, both husband and wife must be sensitive to the emotional and physical state of the other and not insist on sex on demand. What Paul is practicing here is mutual agreement, which is part of the mutual submission that he commands for all married partners in Ephesians 5:21. Please notice in that passage from Ephesians that it's both husband and wife who ought to submit to one another, as every Christian is called upon to do with each other. This idea that only a woman or wife is to be submissive is a horrible distortion, which still provides the evangelical church, especially in our area of Sydney, great headaches. By asserting that neither partner has exclusive rights over his or home body, Paul is transforming sexual politics and power plays, giving a new tenderness in Christian marriage, and insisting that sexual expression is not a matter of manipulation or control, but as part of mutual giving and receiving as an expression of love, and therefore not to be denied either partner. You might want to be very practical and ask, well, okay, how often should a married couple have sex? Jewish tradition took that question very seriously. According to Paul's famous near contemporary Rabbi Eliezer, who came just a little bit after Paul's time, and who wrote in a characteristically patriarchal way, he addressed men and said, well, it depends upon your status and employment. And I quote, he taught, men of independent means, you've got to have sex every day. Workmen, twice a week. Ass drivers, once a week. Camel drivers, once a month. And sailors, at least every 6 months. Must be hard to be a sailor. Thankfully, Paul doesn't get down to such rulemaking, but empowers both people to speak up and calls on both to be sensitive to the needs of the other. It's this type of communication is what helps us in developing a good and healthy sex life. Married couples should also say, let's talk about sex. So let me finish with just a couple of ideas to help guide reflection and conversation. In the marriage book, which accompanies a course that we run here, Nikki and Sila Lee give 6 qualities for great lovers that allows lovemaking to develop in healthy ways. These are communication, tenderness, responsiveness, romance, anticipation, variety. The secret to making love is loving and being loved. In practice, this openness, vulnerability, acceptance means there's not embarrassment about love handles or flabby thighs or varicose veins. It means you can keep the lights on. It means you can be openly passionate, experiment, take risks, by turns have fun and be humorous or intense. Yes, techniques can be learnt, but it's attitudes that are more fundamental. Many factors will influence a healthy sexual relationship, but it stands or falls on the commitment for each partner to be committed to serving the other's sexual needs rather than their own. The quality of the relationship is determined by the equality of this commitment. That's why ethicist David Gushee writes in his book, Getting Marriage Right, that sex is more than a skill. It is a central part of the human person. He adds, the same kind of other-centeredness that is needed in all other aspects of marriage is needed in the bedroom. Marriage flourishes when both partners are looking for ways to please and serve each other. In so doing, they find their own needs met. But this is not going to happen in the bedroom if it is not happening anywhere else. Indeed, every other major dynamic of the marital relationship is both tested and revealed in the couple's sexual relationship. Expectations, communication, conflict resolution, personality and character issues, and the level of justice in the relationship are all brought into the bedroom. Sex is connected to our basic needs for touch and affection, shaped through our history of growing up and what happens to us and what messages we hear. This shapes how we will approach our body, its desires, and another person in a sexual way. When we speak about sex and sexuality, we need to remember that for many, and probably most people, this topic brings personal complications and pain. Despite, or perhaps because of, the heightened importance sex plays in human living, it causes for a great many people deep problems at various points in their life. And for some individuals, it's a source of great ongoing distress. So whilst we might speak glowingly of a biblical picture of healthy sexuality, we must remember the reality that for many it's something far different, and it's a place where healing and restoration need to take place, and this frequently is a project undertaken over many years. It's why Nikki and Sila Lee also give 5 common reasons why the sexual relationship in a marriage can run into difficulties and fizzle out or never get going. These are low self-esteem, unresolved emotions, especially conflicts and hurts, physical problems, tiredness, adjustment to change after childbirth. I'm sure you can think of some others. Working on marriage includes working on sex, but to work on your sex life, you must keep working on your marriage. Good sex is a wonderful and powerful natural intimacy builder. Every other part of our marriage affects our lovemaking, and lovemaking can incorporate and impact other parts of our relationship marriage. We are designed to revel in the attraction we feel towards our husband or wife. The vision is expressing this with our bodies through making love, and that's an appropriate phrase. The fact that romance does not last does not mean it should not be there, but rather it's one of the struggles of being fallen creatures who fall short of the ideals God has for our relationships. I'll include a challenging but wonderful essay which explores this theme in the additional reading sent with the email for this week. In this fallen world, romance is transient, but when we take marriage vows, we testify to the deep meaning that's contained within romantic, passionate sexual expression. That our experience of romance so often peters out and fails to live up to the message that it pretends to does not change the fact that there is eternal endurance in the idea of romance. Passionate romance discloses to us something about our destiny as lovers. In the end, all will be romance. This is why for Paul, marriage is the perfect metaphor for the relationship between Christ the groom and the church, his people, his bride, who are to love one another with all the passion of the lovers in the Song of Songs.